I'm George Gruhn, Gruhn Guitars. Today, October 30th, for our weekly Friday question and answer session. Got questions? And hopefully I'll have answers. And if anybody has more questions, send them on in, because questions submitted during the course of this hour will likely be some that I can get around to answering. And it's a weird world out there. Obviously, elections coming up real soon. Market conditions are, certainly the stock market's going crazy. But throughout all of this, vintage guitars, and for that matter, new guitars, have done quite well this year. I'm glad I'm not running a restaurant. They're not doing so well. But sales of musical instruments for brick and mortar stores that are able to open, we are handling a more limited capacity so far as 4 people at a time in the showroom, so far as customers. But we are able to give good quality service. And so far as online orders, telephone, email, packing and shipping, online appraisals, we haven't skipped a beat this year. And business has been good. And instruments still are high on people's priority of things that they'd like to have. So I'll plow into a few questions. For starters, Robert, in past weeks, you've addressed the binding rot problem often plaguing older guitars. I have a mid-67 Gretsch 6120 that has this issue. Otherwise, the instrument could be described as being in good condition. After much discussion with a local and highly reputable luthier about the cost of repair options versus end value of guitar, we decided on a stopgap measure: a light coating of clear epoxy, sodium bisulfite mixture, as recommended in an article by a nationally known luthier, intended to slow down or arrest the decay, was applied to all of the binding. Thus far, about 2 years out, it appears to have worked. Obviously, the permanent fix is complete removal and replacement of the binding. Could you discuss the cost and practicality of this process? Are there any other options? I fully appreciate the value of rescuing a great guitar purely for the sake of future players, such as my own 2 adult kids, but I wouldn't want to get in too far over my head in this either. Epoxy on the binding can delay, but not really prevent the inevitable. Once the binding starts to deteriorate, it is irreversible. It will continue, and epoxy is not going to keep it going forever. Rebinding especially on Gretsch guitars, is difficult. It doesn't come off easily. And it's an expensive, time-consuming, messy job, which to do right is quite involved. When Fender had a repair shop in Nashville, the Fender Custom Shop and Repair, which they no longer do in Nashville, those folks were able to do a nice clean rebinding, but they always insisted on doing a complete refinish along with it, which is something I would not recommend. Mirabella Guitars in New York does this quite routinely, but they charge as much as $3,000 to rebind a Gretsch guitar. If you have a guitar that's sufficiently valuable or sentimentally valuable enough, that can be worth doing. But the fact remains that it is expensive, it's messy, and in many cases, it's just not economically very practical. If you have something like a 1950s guitar that's starting to do that, most of the 50s guitars actually have better quality binding that hasn't been deteriorating. It's primarily 60s guitars. But some of the 50s models certainly do as well. I've even had D'Angelico guitars that as early as the 1970s, the binding just rotted away. But that was guitars made even in the 40s with nitrocellulose bindings. But on a D'Angelico, if the guitar's worth $20,000 or more, if it costs $3,000 to fix it, you do it. If you have a guitar that's worth $3,000 and it costs $3,000 to fix it, that's problematic. But at any rate, the epoxy is not a permanent solution in our experience. Scott Richardson, I'm a big fan of Dave Evans and saw that you were involved in a documentary about him called Last of the Breed. I've not seen the documentary, but would you please speak to your experience with Dave and or his documentary? Dave's a fine musician, but honestly, I don't remember much about the documentary and I haven't seen it. I do know that it was done in 2013. I've been in a number of documentaries, including Neil Young, Heart of Gold, 2006, Story of the Guitar, 2008, and Last of the Breed in 2013. But I've also been in so many interviews and film snippets and media coverage that I frankly don't remember them all. What I concentrate on is what I do here on a normal basis. The shop's been featured as a backdrop in the Nashville TV show when they had that on. And this building has been used in so many things, from Visa commercial that was on air back in the 1990s, 92. It was on the World Series. It was on the Olympics. It was on everything in between, even including the Weather Channel. I remember more about that because they spent 3 days doing the taping for that. They had a huge budget and they shut down our showroom for 3 days to film a 30-second commercial. But that commercial was seen by people all over the country for a full year. And that was fascinating. But it also was fascinating how much they spent for something where they mentioned Gruhn guitars only in passing, but enough that it was filmed there and people remembered it. But they mentioned that we don't take American Express, which today we do, but back then we didn't. But majority of the people who commented to me on what a great commercial it was couldn't remember the name of the sponsor. About 1/3 remembered I was in it, but it was a great commercial. Another third remembered it as being a Visa commercial. And another third remembered it as being an American Express commercial, which means that they spent millions of dollars on airtime and they had a big budget to produce it. And they gave their competitor fully as much press, so far as people remembering it, as themselves. So I would say that you could write a thesis on how not to advertise by that one. But at any rate, the Heart of Gold and The Last of the Breed were both films that I was involved with. And the Dave Evans story, I honestly haven't even seen it. I remember having been on camera, but it was just another thing that passing memory that was, this shop is available for videos all the time. For John, would you please describe the process your technicians use to clean and recondition the finish on a vintage guitar, and what type of cleaners and polishes are preferred? in general, we don't want to remove the patina on a vintage guitar. And there's a limit to what you can do so far as reconditioning finishes. We don't want to ever remove original finish. And we don't want to really try to hide honest playing wear. If something's been dropped and broken, we're going to fix that and try to make the wound in that instrument as inconspicuous as possible. If it's been broken, we'll do our best to make the crack virtually invisible, but we don't try to make it invisible under black light. We still disclose what we do, but we will do it cosmetically as well as we can, but we will not touch up wear. If something is covered in grunge, if it's just dirt, you can use Maguire company does what they have mirror glaze, and they have a fine grit and a medium and also a heavy grit. We wouldn't use heavy grit. But if something is just covered in grunge, Maguire's is pretty good at getting it off. You have to be very careful about solvents. The fact is that, for example, French polish will be dissolved by alcohol. Also, if you're having a nice sip of scotch and you spill it on your guitar, that's not good if it's a French polish guitar. Or whiskey, wine, anything with alcohol is to be avoided on that type finish. But you have to be very careful which solvents you use. And in general, we don't use a lot of solvents on cleaning guitars. And also, we don't try to buff it to bright shine. We do our best to remove dirt and grunge, but some things don't remove well. For example, tobacco smoke can stain the finish yellow and you just can't get it out. Sometimes if you have mold, a bit of, it needs to be cleaned, and baking soda can also help to get stink of tobacco out of cases and guitars, but also just airing things out helps a lot. But baking soda and just airing things out makes a big difference. But each type of grunge is likely to require something different to get off. So I don't have any one simple solution for everything, but care needs to be taken not to damage the original finish and not to remove normal patina. If you shine it up too much, you actually will reduce the collector's item appeal and reduce its monetary value. Doug Posey says, I saw on your most recent inventory mail, you have a Henderson guitar. It was rather expensive. I looked them up online and it appears to currently be a father-daughter team. They do not appear in the 2020 vintage guitar catalog. I think what you're referring to is not a catalog, but the Vintage Guitar Magazine price guide. Can you provide some background on this custom luthier team? Wayne and his daughter Jane both build guitars. Jane also builds a lot of ukuleles. They are working independently, and they're not simply working where the guitars are labeled as being by both. Wayne is doing his, she's doing hers, and but she did learn the craft with her father, and she's very good at what she does, and Wayne is very good at what he does. Wayne lives very close to Galax, Virginia, but he is a country boy that I first met at the Galax Fiddlers Festival when I went there in 1966. He worked briefly at my shop in the early 70s. He didn't intend to stay and move in Nashville, but he wanted to come experience the big city. And compared to where he lived, it was indeed the big city. One time I visited him and stayed overnight with him at his mother's house, which did not have indoor plumbing. It was, it had electricity, but had a well, did not have indoor plumbing. And so I say he's a country boy, he was, but he also worked for many years as a postal mail carrier. But he retired from that and now devotes full time to music. He also has a music festival that he does. He's an excellent musician, playing old time country music. And he's a very interesting person. He builds fine guitars. We recently did get one in right here. This is a Henderson OM model. I assume it's the one that you were referring to. This particular one is made in 2017. It has Brazilian rosewood back and sides and red spruce top. And Wayne has been involved also with wood harvesting. And he's even been down to Brazil to get some of the wood. Wayne's actually become a bit of a world traveler, as has his daughter, Jane. In fact, Jane, a little over a year ago, was making a trip to Amsterdam to deliver a guitar. And she picked up a guitar for me there, since I knew of one for sale in Amsterdam, and she picked it up and brought it back for me. So I've known Wayne for a long time. He and his daughter both are very fine builders. And he's also got where there are a number of other makers in the immediate area who are building guitars who have been affiliated with him. Wilson is doing good guitars that are very much product of working with Wayne a bit. And Jackson Cunningham, this is one that we will be releasing tonight on our website. This one just came in. It's a Cunningham guitar that's modeled very much after a 1920s Gibson L5. It is a beautifully crafted instrument, remarkably faithful to the original L5 1920s design. It is American hard maple. It's grown very much near where he is. And Cunningham is just basically right down the road in Virginia from Wayne, close neighbor. Red spruce, and Wayne has been involved also with harvest of red spruce. But Cunningham builds a variety of fine flat top guitars, and one of his specialties that he's really known for is this style of, inspired by the 1920s Gibson L5 model. And it is one of the finest archtop guitars, new, that I've ever played. It's an extraordinarily fine instrument. So Wayne has really influenced a bunch of people. So he's a fine builder, and his instruments hold their value very well. There was a bit of a biography written on him, and had made a guitar for Eric Clapton. So that helped the value of his guitars used go up to more and he charges for a new one. But the fact is, a lot of people are willing to pay more for a used Henderson than he charges for a new one. But to get a new one, the waiting list is so long that most folks don't feel that they can wait. So they look to find one used. But at any rate, he is a well-known luthier, a fine player, and an influential player for that matter. But what I can say is that he's definitely inspired some fine people in that area of the country to be building good guitars. So, at any rate, Roger has a question that I so partially covered already regarding a 1964 Guild D40 guitar repairman humidified the guitar. Now it has strong mold smells when it's played. Well, if it didn't smell of mold before and it smells of mold now, one wonders if they humidified it too much. But what's the best way to get rid of the mold? A very light application of a slightly damp cloth with some Lysol can sure enough get rid of mold, but don't get it sopping wet, barely damp. And then baking soda and airing things out can get rid of the smell. But there's obviously also more than one type of mold. Some types of mold, black mold, can be very toxic and very prone to give people severe allergic response. So be careful what you do. But we certainly have had plenty good luck getting rid of mold odor and getting rid of mold effectively. Mold typically is not going to grow well or at all if the guitar is at proper humidity. It takes excess humidity to grow mold on a guitar. And so that should not be too terribly difficult to get rid of. Person named George says there seems to be some affiliation between the Tonk brothers and very early Washburn guitars. I saw some Tonk brothers / Washburn guitars from the 1920s. First of all, I never heard of the Tonk brothers, for example. Is this the same relationship that William S. Stahl had with Larson brothers? Did the Tonk brothers work for Washburn? And did William Stahl work for the Larson brothers? For example, I have a very early mandolin with William S. Stahl on the label, including the mandolin was made in Milwaukee, but did the Larsons build it? Well, there's actually multiple questions here, but I'll try to cover them one by one. Stahl was a music teacher and dealer in Milwaukee. He did commission guitars to be made for him by the Larson brothers in Chicago. The Larson brothers never made guitars with their own name on it. They used several different brand names, Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R, starting as early as 1904. They also had Prairie State guitars that had metal rods through the body, a support rod and another rod that looped around the heel and could be used to adjust neck angle. They made some that said WLS, some that said Euphonon, which was later. And they did some for Stahl that were stamped Stahl, Maker, Milwaukee. And they also made some for Dyer in St. Paul, Minnesota, particularly harp guitars with the Dyer brand. But they never said they never had any that said Larson on them. But the stall guitars that have a paper label typically were not made by Larson. The ones that were made by Larson had a brand in them, but it was branded on the wood inside the instrument, and it was not a paper label. The ones with the paper labels were usually Chicago makers, but not Larson, and they were lesser quality than the Larson instruments and not as valuable. Tonk Brothers and Washburn. The early Washburns are Lyon and Healy. There was not a company early on that was called Washburn. Washburn was a brand name used by Lyon and Healy. But George Washburn Lyon was one of the founders of Lyon and Healy. And originally, Lyon and Healy were two employees of the Oliver Ditson Company. And they were sent to Chicago to set up a branch. It evolved into Lyon and Healy Company, and Washburn, after one of the middle name, George Washburn Lyon, was a brand name. Lyon and Healy in the 1890s and early 1900s had a large factory in Chicago, making thousands of instruments a year. They made Jupiter brand, they made Lyon and Healy brand, they made Washburn brand, they made, I said, a variety. And at any rate, they were not, Washburn was not a separate independent company, it was a brand name. Lyon and Healy closed their guitar factory in 1928. And it went to W.R. Stewart Company, and Tonk Brothers was a distributor. So the Tonk Brothers Washburn brand labeled instruments were made by W.R. Stewart, and some were made by Regal in Chicago. And a few were made by Gibson. And also, confusingly enough, some of this stuff had Gibson component parts and some that were non-Gibson. So Gibson in the 30s was actually selling bodies or component necks. And so there were even guitars that had Gibson components and others that were Chicago area makers. So it is sometimes a confused mess to figure out who made what. But Tonk Brothers were not folks who worked for Washburn, and Washburn was a brand name rather than an actual manufacturer. Now, today, Washburn is a brand name that has been sold a number of times along the way. So current Washburns are primarily made in Asia, although they do, at least I assume they still have a smaller workshop in the USA doing some custom stuff. So the point is, it's a brand name. When you see the name Washburn, there was not a big factory that was called Washburn in the early days. It was Lyon and Healy through 1928. After that, it was a brand name that was made by several different makers over the years. So that's a convoluted evolution of what happened. Marty Evans Please give us your insight as to the Depression era guitars made by the Gibson Company. Do you prefer one make over another? And from a dealer standpoint, what is the apparent aversion to ladder-braced guitars? Well, some of the finest acoustic guitars for steel string guitars made in the history of American guitar making, and certainly for collector's item appeal, were made by a variety of makers during the 1930s, late 20s through the 30s, for steel string acoustic guitars. Gibson also made a variety of other brands, Kalamazoo being one of their better known ones, but also for the Recording King brand. So Ward, Sears Roebuck had guitars made, but Ward Company had Recording King. And Gibson made a lot of guitars for Ward, including some of their earliest electric guitars. And the big orders from Ward for electric guitars are one of the things that inspired Gibson to get heavily into making electric guitars starting in the mid-30s. But the Recording King brand and almost all, the vast majority of the brands that they made, and there were quite a few different brands made by Gibson, featured ladder bracing and no adjustable truss rod in the neck. The ladder bracing was definitely cheaper to do than X bracing, and the truss rod certainly also cost extra to do. There were a few high-end models, such as the Ray Whitley model that was Recording King for Montgomery Ward, that did actually have a truss rod in the neck, but it wasn't actually adjustable because it was hidden. The peghead veneer covered it, and you couldn't see the rod, and you couldn't get to adjust it. It had tension on it, but you couldn't adjust it. But the other models had ladder bracing and no rod in the neck. The Ray Whitley models did have X bracing. But then they did a variety. Gibson actually made over a dozen different brand names, but their primary brand name was Gibson. The Montgomery Ward models were probably the next most expensive. But in general, most of the models Gibson made during the 1930s that were the off-brand, such as Kell Croydon, they did a few X-braced models. Kell Croydon was a house brand. Kalamazoo and Kell Croydon both were Gibson house brands. But typically, most of the house brand items were better than some, like the Kalamazoo models in general were ladder braced. Kell Croydon actually had some X-braced ones that are pretty darn good. I've actually seen an SS Stewart brand that would have been made for B&J wholesalers out of New York, and that was a good quality guitar, X-braced. So they varied in quality, but many of the Kalamazoo models actually sold for under $10 new, and they don't sound equivalent to a Gibson brand. Typically, ladder bracing does not give as smooth or mellow a sound, and so collectors and most musicians don't pay as much for them. But Martin also made quite a few different brand names, but the Martins that were made for others, such as for Ditson and a variety of others, were typically straight Martin quality. They made some beautiful guitars for Oliver Ditson Company, including the earliest Dreadnoughts, and they also made some great guitars for Wurlitzer Company. But back in the 1930s, it was the Depression. They took what business they could get. So Gibson and Martin both did subcontracting, something they don't do today. Today, Martin only wants to make guitars that say Martin on them. And Gibson has their Epiphone brand, but that's a house brand, and most of the Epiphones are Asian imports. There are a few that have been done from 1970 to the present that have been actually made at the Gibson factory. But prior to 1970, Epiphone brand, Epiphone was acquired by CMI, Chicago Musical Instrument Company, in 1957. And from 58 through 69, Epiphones were actually made in the Gibson factory in Kalamazoo. But from 70 onward, when Norlin acquired Gibson, it was under Norlin, it was all Asian import. And then when Henry Juskowitz and his group took over in 86, they did a few Epiphones that were made in the USA, but primarily they were Korean and later Chinese. At any rate, ladder-braced guitars from the 30s are not nearly as expensive as the X-braced real Gibson brand. They cost, some of them, as well under $10 new. But the best of them are the Ray Whitley models. They made a rosewood Whitley and a mahogany Whitley. Those bring serious money. Larry, my question is, did Martin do arched backs on some early D28s and D45s? The answer is Martin doesn't do flat backs. They all have a bit of arch to them, and the tops do as well. If you build a top and back absolutely flat and have sides that are quite rigid, it doesn't leave any room for expansion and contraction to have room to go up and down slightly without damage. And with changes in humidity, wood can swell with humid conditions and shrink in drier conditions. And if you have a very slight arch, barely noticeable in the top, and a bit more arch in the back, it is structurally stronger, and it gives more room for some flex up and down with changes in humidity. If it's absolutely flat in the winter, you have greatly increased risk of cracking. So if you look carefully at Martin's, all of the backs have arch. The arch in the back is more prominent than in the top, but it is there. And it's not simply arched across, it's arched lengthwise. So if you look at the length of the body, there's a bit of arch, and the same for the back. It's arched lengthwise and across. Joe, your recent post introducing us to Shelton, the tortoise, has prompted me to ask for your thoughts on the mini proliferation of high-end picks like Blue Chip, Wagon, and others. Also, how do you feel about actual tortoise shell picks? Actual tortoise shell picks, if you want to get technical, if you're a herpetologist who studies reptiles, they didn't ever make picks out of true tortoise shell. What's called tortoise shell is actually from the hawksbill sea turtle, which is a turtle, but not technically a tortoise. Tortoises are terrestrial, and they have certain very specific anatomical features that the shell keratin covering on the shell is bony, but it has a living cover that's similar to fingernail composition, but there's also blood vessels and real, the shell is very much alive. But at any rate, genuine hawksbill turtle is protected It is illegal to sell and distribute tortoiseshell products in the US and in most developed countries in the world. It's Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And by the standards of the treaty, even if you have an antique piece of tortoise shell, if you rework it and cut it into a pick, it's considered new. So it's still illegal. Now, that may or may not make any sense, but I don't recommend that any dealer should be selling that because it is illegal. And if you buy it, beware that it is something that if Fish and Wildlife Agency catches you with it, you could have real problems. There are numerous other picks out there. The blue chips are quite expensive. They're made with a space age plastic that was designed for, actually for NASA. And it is very hard, very durable. The picks do give good sound, but they're expensive, like over $30 for a pick. And the material is capable of maintaining physical integrity and not expanding or contracting over an extreme range of temperature as high as over boiling point and as low as liquid nitrogen temperature. So do you really need a pick that has a stable, no expansion or contraction within that range? Well, at liquid nitrogen or at temperatures way above boiling point of water, you'd be dead. So you don't really need that. There are other plastics that will do a similar enough job for picks that don't cost as much, but the type plastic that is in the picks that I checked on it, and it's for a fairly small sheet, it's over, it's in thousands of dollars. So when they cut those sheets for picks, that's one reason why those picks are particularly expensive. I happen to be quite happy with picks that are Dunlop picks and graduated thicknesses that cost under $1. But the Wegan makes a fine pick. The blue chips are unquestionably very fine picks. The genuine so-called tortoiseshell picks do sound good. They do feel good. But again, they're not legal. It's environmentally unsound. We don't sell them. And occasionally one comes in a guitar case with an old pre-World War II instrument. And but the fact is, at this point, do I carry any tortoiseshell picks with me? No. And we don't sell them. We don't use them. And we're not going to recommend them in spite of how good they may be. Karsten, what is your understanding of Brazilian rosewood use in the late 1960s? Martin had more than other companies, and I'm aware that it lasted until 69/70. Was there any early 1966 Fender guitar that had Brazilian rosewood fretboards? The transition from Brazilian rosewood to alternative woods for Fender started virtually immediately after Fender was sold to CBS, which was January of 1965. But they were still using up pre-CBS parts for a while. So early 65 Fenders do have Brazilian rosewood fingerboards, but it didn't take very long at all before that was gone. And the switch primarily to pau ferro, it's another South American wood, sometimes called Bolivian rosewood or morado, took place during 65. And I don't recall seeing any 1966 fenders with Brazilian rosewood fingerboards. It's conceivable that some leftover neck might have gotten used, but they certainly weren't making them then, and I don't recall seeing any. Martin stopped using Brazilian in very late 1969. Brazilian rosewood was not illegal and not on the Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty until it was listed in June 11th of 1992. But earlier than that, what prompted Martin to switch was that the Brazilian government wanted to not simply sell logs, but to get to process the wood in Brazilian sawmills. There weren't very many Brazilian sawmills, but they figured that it would encourage industry if they mandated that the only rosewood you could get from Brazil would be cut and processed in Brazilian sawmills rather than in just form of logs. Martin didn't want wood cut in Brazilian sawmills. They wanted to have it well seasoned. And the Brazilian economy at that time was pretty well a third world economy. They wanted money quick. So when they cut down Brazilian rosewood, Dalbergia nigra, a lot of it was cut into veneer, which didn't need to be well seasoned. And they'd also slab cut logs rather than quarter cut, which meant that structurally, as well as lacking seasoning, it just wasn't the same. So Martin switched to using Indian rosewood, which was readily available, cost a little bit less at the time, and did not have to be cut in Indian mills. They could get wood that could be well seasoned, which they could season themselves. So even today, Martin's standards for the way their wood is seasoned and acclimated is very rigid. They want wood that is well seasoned and thoroughly stabilized to their standards. They don't want to have wood that was slab cut. They certainly don't want veneer. And they just couldn't use the wood that was being offered to them from Brazilian sawmills. And that was the impetus for the switch from Brazilian to Indian rosewood at Martin in 1969. There's still occasionally you'll see something in 1970 that still has Brazilian. There's a few, but not many from Martin. And in the D35s, there were a moderate number of D35s with the three-piece backs. Sometimes the two outer pieces on the back would be Brazilian and the center one might be Indian, or vice versa. Two pieces of Indian with a Brazilian center, and sometimes the sides were Brazilian and sometimes they were Indian in early to mid 1970. But after 1970, about the only thing you see Brazilian rosewood on with Martin was custom order. And they still have some wood left, but there's very little wood in Brazilian that Martin can buy that they feel has the right documentation with it that will pass legal muster. They are not using it. And Gibson is not using it either. They ended up, Gibson had enough trouble with wood out of Madagascar that lacked proper documentation, and also some wood out of India for rosewood and ebony that came through, where Fish and Wildlife Authority claimed that they didn't have the proper documentation. This got settled with considerable cost to Gibson legally and otherwise. So Gibson is currently not using Brazilian rosewood, and Brazilian rosewood is just too much trouble to travel with as well, because again, you're into difficult problems with documentation. So don't want to use it. And he also had a question, the same person, Karsten, could you please comment on the phrase bandied around regarding Gibson guitars, good wood era, and it seems to be used in connection with 1990s era electric guitars. It doesn't make any sense to me. Well, it actually doesn't make any sense to me either. So unless you can come up with more information, I'm not at all sure what is being discussed here. There's nothing about 1990s Gibsons that has magically good wood. But the fact remains that Gibson and Martin and numerous other companies today are making better guitars now than they did even 50 years ago. But 50 years ago, as I've said numerous times, 50 years ago was 1970, and that was some of the poorest quality guitars in the history of American guitar making. Jeffrey asked, did you ever have a guitar come into the store that by all accounts should have been a dud, but turned out to be an outstanding sounding guitar? I mean, a guitar that was made in some distant factory, but by chance, all the stars aligned such that the neck, back, sides, top, and braces all harmonized perfectly as if a skilled builder had made it, one in a million. Well, frankly, I have seen a few old Ks and Harmonies and Regals that sounded really good, especially for blues, and that just had soul and personality. But typically, when I'm pricing a guitar, I'm going to price it based on reputation of the maker, track record of sales for that maker's work, age of the instrument, rarity of the model, but make, model, age. It's not simply age, being old is always better, but was it made during the golden era of that particular maker, which in some cases, like for Jimmy DeCristo, died in 1995, some of his very best were his last ones. Individual luthiers, often enough it is their last ones that are the best when they had the most experience. But again, there are also times when I see a maker that I'd never heard of, and it's really, really good. And once in a while, there's things coming from sources you wouldn't necessarily expect. Like I was at the NAMM show in January, right before COVID crisis. This for next year, 2021, the NAMM show has already been canceled as far as any in-person event. But here's a guitar I found at the NAMM show in January, Altamira company, but they have some that are strictly handmade, as well as it's a small workshop, but they have some that are totally handmade. This is a copy of an 1850s Antonio de Torres Spanish guitar, and their head luthier studied in Spain. They actually studied a real Torres and copied it in exquisite detail. And this is a guitar that is made in China, but it is handmade, and it is one of the finest sounding classical guitars I've ever played. And it's been in my shop for just right now less than a month, and everybody who has played it has been totally and completely astonished. But this is not a funky craftsman guitar. This is actually a beautifully crafted guitar from China that we are selling for $4,500. And it was expensive for me to buy. The point is, that's at least a source that people may not be aware that there are guitars made in China, that if you have the right craftsman, he can be in China, he could be in Germany, he could be in Spain, he could be in the US. But there are now some makers in China who are capable of doing some phenomenal work, but it isn't cheap. On the other hand, it's not as expensive as some of the ones made in Europe, where labor costs a great deal more. But it is still a guitar that we're selling for $4,500, and we're not getting rich on it. So that was a surprise to me, to find that there are now some guitars made in China that are that good, that they're astonishingly fine. Gregory Randall, hi George. What is the story behind Gruhn Guitar's mascot? Did you design it? Thanks so much, Greg Randall. Well, yeah, I designed it. That's Freddie Beastie. And his baby pictures go back to 1963. And there's also lots of friends that Freddie has. And they visited me starting around 63, and I was able to draw their pictures. And, I couldn't photograph them. They didn't show up in a mirror, but I could draw them and I could see them. And so, yes, Freddie is the logo that I drew. He started out looking pretty much like the picture I'm drawing as I talk. There it is. See, I can draw Freddie real quick, but on the logo, he's playing guitar. That takes a little longer to draw. I can draw one of those in maybe a minute and a half. But at any rate, I've done some fairly elaborate pictures of Freddie and his friends. We even have t-shirts that I drew last year that are not only interesting shirts front and back, but are blacklightable. And we have those available. But Freddie has been sort of an alter ego of mine from 63 onward. So that's how he came to be. Gary Marini, hi George, what in the Martin line is a good singer guitar? Well, frankly, anybody can play on pretty well any Martin if you sing. But I happen to think that for most singer-songwriter types, the triple O or OM or the quadruple O size that we have in Central Mahogany are great guitars, but really any size Martin guitar will work fine to sing with. And Martin makes great guitars, as do plenty of others. It's a matter of just personal preference. Jim Albrecht, typically how much emphasis would you place on a guitar purchase, including original hard shell case? There will be outliers, but when you say that original case can boost price by 20% or more. Well, I guess it depends on what make and model guitar it is, but you know, if it's a pre-war D45 that could push $350,000 to $400,000, the original case is nice, but if the guitar is in great condition, with or without the original case, it's not going to make much difference percentage-wise on the value. But some original cases will sell for over $1,000. But if you have a guitar that's worth $100,000, the original case is not going to make terribly much percentage-wise difference. If somebody wants it badly and you have a great example, with or without the original case, it's saleable. But we certainly prefer to have original case. With a Sunburst Les Paul from 58, 59, or 60, those 5-latch cases can bring a few $1,000s. If it's a Flying V or Explorer or Gibson from 58 or 59, if it doesn't have the original case, people freak because there are so many very accurate copies that if it doesn't have the original case, which is really hard to copy, it's harder to make a copy of the case than it is to make the copy of the guitar. And when it doesn't have the original case, that is a big red flag for those. On early Fenders, if you have a broadcaster, they really do want that original thermometer bulb type case. But again, if you have a beautiful, clean, obviously original example, if it doesn't have the original case, the guitar is still very saleable. The biggest red flag on any of them is the Flying V and the Explorer. People freak if they don't have the original case. But even there, if you go over it, if somebody goes over it carefully, if it's a truly reputable source and it's well vetted, even those are still very saleable with or without the original case. But most collectors really, really do want that case if they can get it. And they're always concerned. Spend a great deal of extra time examining any instrument of that particular, those two models that doesn't have the right case. Dave King, good morning, George. In your opinion, what are the quality differences between the current Guild D55 and 512 12-string guitars and those that were manufactured in Rhode Island prior to 2001? When they left, when Guild was removed by Fender from Rhode Island and located to Corona, California, in my opinion, quality went down. When it was moved again to Tacoma, Washington, they still had quality issues. Those are not as desirable. When they moved them to New Hartford, Connecticut, the old Fender, the old Ovation factory, quality was good. And those, I think, probably compare well. They put a lot of effort into redesigning, but it didn't last long. They were not profitable, and Fender closed that operation. Guild guitars now are made in California for the American ones and China for the imports. They are good quality Chinese imports and they are good quality American guitars. The new American-made Guilds compare favorably to the guitars made in Westerly, Rhode Island. They're fully as good, if not better, but they're also quite expensive. The new ones cost every bit as much, if not more, than a Martin. I don't sell them. I sell a lot of Martins. I don't carry new Guilds. I was involved with the Guild company, designing guitars for them, starting in 1984. And I was part of a group that took over Guild in 86. I was their executive vice president of research and development and artist relations for Guild from August of 86 through 88. And I found about the joys of being a minority shareholder and how it didn't go well. And I'd say that one could write a master's thesis, maybe even a PhD thesis on how not to run a company by studying Guild's management at that time. But at any rate, new Guilds made in California are good guitars. Whether they're worth the money or not compared to other brands, that I'll leave to others to figure out. They are good guitars, but they do cost every bit as much, if not more, than a similar spec Mark. Bob Mend says, could you go into the Moderne that came from early wine? And I'd have to say the answer to that is I don't know anything about a Moderne that came from anybody that is original from the 1950s. There's been people who've offered to pay as much as $1 million for one if one would turn up. And I have yet to hear of anyone coming up with an original 1950s Gibson Moderne. So that's news to me. And if anybody out there knows of one, by all means, send me info, send me pictures. But I sure haven't heard it. And I'm skeptical as to whether any exist. Kevin Christensen, why does my 1921 Gibson A2 seem to have a richer sound than my 1916 A2? As my luthier in Tennessee used to say, most of those A models from the teens and 20s pre-Lore sound pretty good without much deviation. So did Gibson make some kind of alteration in the choice of wood or bracing, or something else to cause the distinct difference in voice in the same model built 5 years apart? There really ought not to be any great difference in the body, but in 1921, that was the first year that Gibson started to use adjustable truss rods. And those necks, therefore, are adjustable. And there is a bit of difference in tone. Also, 21 was the year in which Gibson started to use adjustable bridges. So you have two factors that changed in 21. And in general, the ones with the adjustable rod in the neck and with the adjustable bridge do bring more money than the earlier ones. By 1925, they were starting to use maple on the backs and sides on the A models, whereas the earlier ones were birch. But in 21, it would still be birch. But I would expect on 21, most 21s would have the adjustable neck rod and the adjustable bridge. And those are two things that most certainly can affect sound. He asks a similar question, did Gibson make any significant changes in the F4 models from the early pre-Lore 20s and in the post-Lore 30s? When I compare my 1921 F4 to F4s made in the 30s, they are two different instruments. Well, there were a lot of changes by the time you get into the 30s, but there's also changes as early as soon as they started putting in the adjustable rod and the adjustable bridge. Now, the earliest 21 bridges had a narrower base and they had an aluminum top. Those were very brief. And then they came out with the later wood top, wood bottom, and the really sort of classic adjustable Gibson bridge. And they didn't change dramatically until starting in the early 30s. But the quality of the Gibson F4s from at least 22 through the earliest ones, the adjustable rod on the F4s, they still had the double flower pot inlay and the truss rod routing just cut right into the inlay pattern. They're a little funky and the necks were bigger, but starting by late 22, the neck dimensions went narrower, more modern feel. And those are great instruments. And by the mid 30s, they were using a much thicker lacquer finish and the tops were thicker, and they just were not as responsive. So there were gradual changes. They continued to make F4 models right into the very early 40s. And the later ones are definitely much less responsive and not as pretty either. They changed the inlay pattern and the much thicker finish. And he asks also, why does my 1921 Gibson A2 have a richer sound than my 21 F4, which is thin by comparison? It even seems that the A2 has more volume by comparison. Well, there's no particular reason why an A model shouldn't sound as good on an oval hole model as the so-called F models. The F models have a scroll and 2 points, but the points are sealed off. And they don't actually contribute to the sound of the instrument. And the scroll is semi-solid, so that also doesn't really contribute to the sound of the instrument. I can, if you'll excuse me for just a moment, I'll get up and I'll grab an F model and be able to show what I'm talking about. All right, we have here 2 Gibson mandolins. This is a 19, let's see, this one here is, I believe, a 1923, A4, and you can see it has an adjustable truss rod. You can see the screws, but there is a truss rod, bell-shaped truss rod cover. Get it at the right angle there, you can see, yeah, it has a truss rod cover, and it has the adjustable bridge. This mandolin has a symmetrical body. The F models have a scroll and points. This is a 1931 F5. The F4 model has an oval hole rather than the F holes. The F5 was introduced in early 1922, but the F4 looks similar to this, but has the neck joins at the 12th fret here, whereas this neck joint, this line here, the neck, that's at the 15th fret here on an F5. But on the F4, that line would be up here. So you have fewer frets clear of the body. Basically, the reason for that is if you have an oval hole here, you can have the oval holes placed at the end of the fingerboard, and to put the bridge in the right place, the scale length on the short neck models, F4 or A model, you can see the scale length from bridge to nut is exactly the same on the so-called the short neck, which some people call a short scale, but it's not a short scale. Scale length from nut to bridge is the same here as here, and it is the same on an F4. But on the F4, because it has a oval sound hole here, the bridge is moved up to here to have the right spacing. But when you put F holes here, you want to center the bridge on the F holes. And with the scale, if you center the F holes you put the bridge there, then you need a longer neck to do it, because otherwise, if you have the same length from nut to saddle, you've got to have that longer neck here, but they're the same scale. But the F5 is the most sought after of all the Gibson models. This particular one is 1931, but the original one signed by Lloyd Loar came out in 22 and were made through December of 24. So at any rate, that's it for that one. He had one last question. Which type bridge do you recommend for those post-Loar Gibson A's and F5s, which have the one-piece bridge? And those pre-war, excuse me, for those pre-Loar Gibsons, which do you recommend? I've experimented with the Brecky adjustable bridge as well as the Cumberland acoustic Loar replica. I've even tried a one-piece Red Henry bridge that I had lying around. Steve Smith's Loar replicas have improved the tone and volume of most of the mandolins I've owned, but it hasn't really brought this F5 to life. So I expected the tubby sound of the oval mandolins, that throaty bass growl, but not at the expense of fat round sound of the treble. Well, again, I haven't seen your F4, but in general, I like the Loar style Gibson adjustable bridge. It's the 1921 patent bridge. It actually came out before the F5. So the F5 was not the first Gibson mandolin to feature F-hole. It features the first one to feature F-holes and parallel tone bars, but it was not the first one to feature an adjustable rod or an adjustable bridge. And it's even debatable just how much Loar actually did in designing the instrument. Most of the patents involved were actually in the name of Lewis Williams. And so Loar signed the labels, there's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt that Loar was one of the owners of the Divitone company in the 30s, making electric as well as acoustic instruments. And they are interesting historically because Loar was involved, but the quality of them, the playability, the workmanship, the sound, doesn't remotely resemble the Loar signed Gibson instruments of the 1920s, leading one to wonder how much did Loar really have to do with that. At any rate, the standard Gibson adjustable bridge design right there is a great bridge. And there are a number of people doing them. So that type bridge is readily available. But as to why your particular F4 is not putting out the sound until I see it and have a chance to go over it to figure out why it's doing what it does, I don't have an answer other than they don't all sound exactly alike. And they do vary in thickness of top, and they vary in sound, and no two pieces of wood sound quite alike. And just as there was an earlier question about how do you occasionally encounter instruments that are just better than they ought to be? Yes, well, occasionally the reverse is true. Sometimes you get an instrument that is the right make and the right model and everything looks right. And you're darned if you can figure out why it just doesn't sound as good as most of them. And instruments have soul and personality, and some suit you better than others. And sometimes what suits one person may not suit another. No two musicians have quite exactly the same touch. And if you just can't get the sound out of it and it's in nice condition, you can sell it or trade it to somebody who will appreciate it more than you do. And if it's in fine original condition, it'll still sell very well, whether I think it sounds great or not, if it's the right make, model, and condition and thoroughly original. Anyway, till next week, look forward to hearing from you then, and we'll take it from there.